your initial sets are up to 3 times more efficient than your final sets at the end of this curve.
Volume demonstrates a pretty reliable relationship with improving hypertrophy. Yes, there's limitations to that in terms of the way the dose-response relationship looks, like we just discussed.
And at this point, we can actually get to the main results here, which is the primary meta-regression for the effects of fractional volume on hypertrophy. And of the different model types that were assessed, a square root relationship was the best fit. And you can see that visualized here on the left-hand side. So on the x-axis of panel A is an increasing number of weekly set volume, again, quantified in the fractional method. And then on the y-axis is the exponentiated response ratio presented as a percentage change in muscle size. On the right-hand side here, that is the marginal linear slope at the average set volume from the effects. So the average set volume, 12.25 sets per week. So what you're looking at on the right is the slope at 12-ish sets per week. And as you can tell here, that marginal slope was positive, right? So we see a positive dose-response relationship. That value of the marginal slope is 0.24% for each additional set, again, at that average value of about 12 sets per week. And we mentioned before Schoenfeld's linear regression indicated about 0.38% per additional set. So this is smaller, but I'd say still comparable. And ultimately, that marginal slope, the credible interval of that, the entire credible interval of that exceeds 0. So just kind of at its most fundamental level, what that tells us is that there's a positive dose-response relationship here that appears to be pretty dang consistent. Now, there's a lot more to get into in terms of interpreting this beyond that, but just broad strokes, hey, it's positive, it goes up, and at the mean set volume, it is significant if you were to categorize it as such. I'd say going into it before extraction, just, having read all the studies at some point, but not like completely systematically, I definitely expected stronger diminishing returns. And if you pinned me down at that time, I probably would have said there would have been something resembling an inverted U, or at least the start of it. You got to keep in mind that was a while ago. That was like before the Ennis paper was out, for example, and then, maybe there was like more discussion around it, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of in the background, we were just extracting all this stuff, and as new stuff came out, I added it to the data set, that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm surprised. I thought there would be at least a plateau, and I would not be surprised if upon additional data, whether that is at higher volumes and or at the control effects, whether we would see stronger diminishing returns. And speaking of the diminishing returns, while we're kind of double clicking on that point, this might be a good time to discuss the table, which we'll pull up here in a second, is reported because I think it helps us do two things. The first is conceptualize and understand the diminishing returns that the plot is showing, and also put them into context with the smallest detectable effect size we discussed before. Because if you look at that plot, it just looks like it goes up in a lot of ways. And you could definitely just chuck that down on the table or put it on the screen for whatever platform you're posting on, and just say there's a very strong dose-response relationship, which might be a fair interpretation. But I think this does a good job of kind of showing you the degree to which diminishing returns occur. So we've done what we believe to be the most balanced way to look at the minimum effective dose, which is basically, hey, after control adjusting, at what point do you have pretty high confidence that you are going to experience hypertrophy that's detectable and that's unlikely to be due to error? In a lot of ways, the minimum effective dose is probably just one set, because that was still a positive value. And then you could get into a discussion of obviously one set is effective because it's going to be better than 0, even if you're attenuating atrophy. But nonetheless, minimum effective dose, or maybe better characterized as minimal detectable dose, appears to occur around 4 fractional weekly sets. And then the tiers you see on the screen here are basically just additional increments to get additional volume increments to get an additional increment in the smallest detectable effect size, which is 2.05%. And you can see the diminishing returns I still think are pretty strong. The kind of easiest way to interpret this is to look at the beginning of the curve and the end of the curve. So the first 4 sets, so the first increment in the smallest detectable effect size is the minimum effective dose. And that requires 4 sets. But to get the final increment, which is the lowest efficiency tier from 30 to 42 fractional weekly sets, requires more than 4 times that, about 12.5 sets for additional increment of detectable hypertrophy. So your efficiency gets cut into a third, right? Or in other words, your initial sets are up to 3 times more efficient than your final sets at the end of this curve. And obviously it's kind of that those diminishing returns are gradual, and that the goal of the table is to portray those diminishing returns with the best fit model.
Yeah, I think just to restate what Josh said, maybe in a different way, is just essentially with this, what we're trying to do is, so in a lot of other meta-analyses, they've kind of categorized on the front end, right? And what we're essentially do is categorizing on the back end after things have been estimated, maybe arguably a little bit more appropriately. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, how many more sets does it take to increase by what we're considering a meaningful amount, which is this number that we've gotten from these, I can't remember how many it was, tons of control groups from the STEEL data. And essentially what that's doing is that's demonstrating that I think, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, we haven't talked about this a ton, I think the diminishing returns are going to be underestimated across social media in comparison to what I think they demonstrate. I think if you understand this relative to kind of what we can detect, relative to, our expectations and things like that, I think that to me, when I looked at these tiers and kind of understood and talked through it with you, because this is all your idea and it was a really, really good idea, I think it just highlights to me that these diminished returns are maybe a little bit more aggressive than I realized, relative to what we can detect and our confidence and things like that. So yes, volume demonstrates a pretty reliable relationship with improving hypertrophy. Yes, there's limitations to that in terms of the way the dose-response relationship looks, like we just discussed. But I think this incorporates the fact that, yes, there is a reliable effect, but it also, depending on how you look at it, appreciably diminishes relative to what we can actually detect and consistently identify in research. So I think this is a really, really good addition, because I think if we would have just left it with the kind of the main plot, people are going to see that linear marginal slope. It's positive. That's my kind of pooled effect size that I would get from a forest plot. I'll run with that and probably overinterpret it. But because we have a nonlinear dose response shape, these types of classifications or practical tools to go out in the field with are really, really important. And I think this does a really good job communicating, hey guys, yes, volume seems to be an important aspect of the hypertrophy equation. But at the upper ends of this of the volumes that we've explored, they are increasingly less efficient. And I think for the average person, this is particularly important. For people who are extreme, strength and physique enthusiasts, maybe any gain is justifiable, and their smallest effect size of interest really is 0. And if there's any identifiable effect, maybe they're going to want to increase the volume. And those are the people that are going to be doing specialization cycles with 45 sets per muscle group. Great. But for other people, particularly with multiple training goals or also just those with other considerations, I think this efficiency tier list is extremely helpful to kind of think through that from a practical lens and think about where is my greatest ROI, particularly when I'm considering kind of the whole body training program.